Right. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Happy New Year. My name is Manon and I work for Film Hub North. So thank you for joining us today for the second edition of the BFI FAN Green Hour. The Green Hour is a new online learning series for film exhibitors who are focusing on environmental sustainability. This is a nationwide program open to all members of the regional and national film hubs. Today, we are going to look at how to implement low-carbon procurement processes and the organizational demands and benefits of responsible sourcing. And I'm really happy to be joined today by Natasha Padbury, Office and Sustainability Manager at the Depot Cinema in Lewes, and Simon Curtis, Chair of the Great Manchester Art Sustainability Team, aka GMAST. So welcome to you both. During the first half of the session, Natasha and Simon are going to give you an overview of what we mean exactly by green procurement, and they're going to share practical examples on how to implement place-based, climate-driven decision. There will be a 20-minute Q&A afterwards, so please do pop your questions, and we'll get back to you after the presentation. The light in the building that I'm at has turned off, and that is proof of green sustainability procurement processes in practice, but it makes for a bit of an awkward moment right now. So I'm just going to move a bit till the light turns back on. This meeting is being recorded, so when you will look back into this, you will have that moment forever on YouTube on the BFI fan channel. But yeah, there is live captioning available throughout the session. You just need to click on the CC function. And we're going to get started with, first off, Simon, who's going to talk about GMAST and their work. So I'll go off camera and I'll leave it to you, Simon. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Manon. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen and see if I can. Whoa. If I put it in the right place. So yeah, hi, I'm Simon. I act as convener for GMAST. We're a place-based network up in Greater Manchester, and we bring together 70 kind of organisations across the city region who are part of what we refer to as the cultural sector. And it doesn't really matter where the money comes from. There can be subsidised organisations, privately funded organisations, but what we've got in common is that we've been working together for about 12 years now on our sector's impact and also kind of supporting local climate targets. So over the years, we've explored what we might call procurement and also kind of localized resilience in various different ways. And I thought I'd share today some of the things I think we've learned, or certainly some of the thematic things that are important. So now's probably a good time just to talk about the emissions scopes, and I imagined kind of lots of people know this already. Scope 1 and 2 kind of get a lot of airtime, but scope 3 is where most of the impact sits. Typically 80% of an organisation's emissions will be in scope 3. So what are those scopes? Well, just in brief, kind of scope 1 is your direct emissions, those that come from your buildings and company vehicles through fuel you consume, gas boilers, diesel, the gas and air conditioners. Scope 2 is the electricity you procure. We'll talk a bit more about that later. And then scope 3, unhelpfully, is everything else. So that's all of the goods and services and activities of your organization, things that you don't necessarily own or control. And as we say, they're usually the greatest share of your kind of impact, where, business, travel, wastewater, all of those things sit there. We live in a globalized economy, and that means that many of the things that we procure, we buy, are made of materials extracted and then put together from all different places, kind of all over the world. For example, a very big ship, if we remember, gets stuck in a canal somewhere, and suddenly the people in the UK can't buy garden furniture because it's all been jammed there. But seriously, in 2021, I looked this up, about 1.95 billion metric tons of cargo was shipped globally. And that's just by sea, and that's about 80% of the total. So when we're thinking about procurement, kind of on a global and local scale, we really need to think about kind of the impact, cutting the impact of travel and where things are coming from. This is a sculpture that you can see at Canary Wharf, and it's called Traffic Light Tree by Pierre Vivant. And I really like this because it's always a great one to kind of makes me kind of really want to sum up the kind of slightly confusing world we live in, and the lots of choices we get, and but also the kinds of the disparity between the kind of messages we're getting. So as I said, kind of now we've just looked at the scopes and kind of globalized things. Kind of what did we find out at GMAST? Well, one of the things that I think is really important when you're beginning to think about procurement is to set your shared values. So some organizations have this kind of built in. Maybe they've paid a consultant to come in. Sometimes it's as simple as a conversation. But what are your values? And what are your values around climate and environment? And kind of what's the difference that you want to make? I think focusing on values and really exploring those can help make some of the decision-making process more straightforward, because you revert to your values, and so maybe those choices narrow because some things definitely don't fit with what you want to do. In a similar vein, I think that the Sustainable Development Goals are really useful. Those 17 goals that were adopted by all UN members in 2015, they can feel a little abstract perhaps kind of at the beginning, but when you kind of start applying them to your kind of organization and kind of what you do and what the the changes maybe you want to make, you can see yourself reflected in kinds of many of these. So if you're wanting a bit of inspiration, I'd recommend going there. Obviously, kind of cultural venues, cinemas kind of rely kind of a lot of our impact, kind of controllable impact is coming from our operations. So kind of however they manifest, a good example is kind of food and beverage, and that's often key to any kind of business model. Often these are franchised and worked in partnership. Therefore, how we set up these agreements and the expectations for ethical and lower carbon impact needs to be written into those kind of tenders, into those agreements. Maybe you want to set KPIs as necessary. I'm just going to quickly check the chat. Great, that's lovely. I'm not talking too quickly. Get rid of the chat now. Cool. So maybe having a procurement policy is useful to you, but particularly kind of, I think it's around when these tenders come up. They're when you can make choices with contractor partners about what chemicals they're using, what's going to be served in the kind of bar and restaurant, and you can really make your big decisions. Those contracts are often kind of, for periods of 3 years, 5 years. So kind of those opportunities don't come up so often. But if we're being recommended to eat, a third less or consume a third less meat and dairy, then our food and beverage offer should reflect that. If we're being told that kind of our rivers and our waterways are really polluted, we have an obligation to reduce and remove the chemicals that we're using within our buildings. Another area that is really important when it comes to procurement is around energy, and green tariffs and green energy can be really confusing. They're often kind of mixed up in all kinds of claims by kind of energy companies. Some really good guidance from Julie's Bicycle around this, particularly if you're a subsidized organization and you're reporting around which energy suppliers count as zero carbon and which don't. But yeah, energy in itself can be a challenge if you really, really want to get properly carbon neutral energy. Waste is also kind of important, kind of what's in our waste streams is something we need to consider. What is being caught and recycled by the contractor you're using, what's not, and of course what can't be, and what can we do to kind of remove that from the operation. Also, kind of, and again, moving a little more into kind of a little more into scope 3, our money is really important in terms of the impact and influence it's having on the climate emergency. How we bank, how we insure, can kind of have a, can really encourage the fossil fuel industry or discourage it. So kind of here's a here's a kind of big high street bank and credit card company, and you can see that kind of working with them is not helping investment in green projects. And kind of it brings us really to kind of this is great. This is Greenpeace doing a demonstration about greenwashing, and I wanted to just kind of really draw attention to that. It's we're in this really confusing world of conflicting information. Everybody and anybody will probably tell you they're green, and sometimes it's hard to really kind of cut through this. The other slide I had for this is like a really green murky water which says it kind of just as well, and you can read some amazingly convincing climate kind of climate discourse in any place. If you want to check out BP's environmental page, which is amazingly well kind of produced, but obviously they're BP with the reputation they have. So we as consumers, as procurers, thinking about things in terms of their impact, be they ethically or environmentally or both, have to navigate it and kind of look for what we consider reality in what can be a confusing landscape. We also kind of have to think about what we're putting out there. So what are we talking about as an organization publicly? And are we being honest? Are we using our integrity about about the impact that we're having? Are we contributing to the greenwash by drawing attentions to really good things we're doing, but kind of hiding the fact that there are some other things that we're not doing? So I think that's really a really important thing to consider. This is an interesting thing to kind of interesting thing. This is an interesting survey, the results of a survey that you might have engaged with last year, but it's the Act Green survey, and it looks at kind of audience expectations and response to the climate emergency, and it's a real window into what kind of English audiences are thinking, and also what they think in terms of the responsibility as a cultural organization to drive change and to kind of influence. So sometimes we kind of, sometimes within organizations, we're worried that kind of if we're too preachy or we're too forward about kind of climate issues, we'll put the audience off. This really contests that and says actually that audiences are really interested. So if we can have a look at just who contributed to that last year, and cinemas are pretty small, so kind of encouraging kind of film and broadcast to kind of really contribute to this. But I think we can pretty much assume that the results will be similar. I encourage you to kind of engage with that report. It's really easily downloadable from the Indigo website. Something else to consider is good practice. So this is where Manon's sat, probably in the dark again by now. home in Manchester. It's a cinema theatre gallery complex in the city. They've done some really, really brilliant work, and I know that Debbie and the team there are always really happy to share their experience. I think kind of they've been working on this for a long time. You can't engage with home without understanding their commitment to sustainability, to climate, and to local targets. And there's lots of stuff on their website. They've very particularly used something called carbon literacy training as a way to engage their full team in co-creating their policies and their actions. Some other good places to look. The Arts Green book came out last year, I believe, and looks at cultural spaces. It's sort of quite headline, but there's some areas to kind of look at. I'm sure many people have already seen this as well. This is the Green Cinema Toolkit that Julie's Bicycle worked on with the industry, I think last year or the year before. One of the things that I found useful, partly because I was asked a question about that I couldn't answer, is I engaged with this, the ethical consumer. And it's really interesting to begin. It's more kind of domestic, but it's really interesting in terms of the way that it kind of scores different companies and different products, you know. So I'm on a little bit of a journey to kind of de-chemical my home, and kind of it's proving really interesting in terms of kind of, you know, the what's in various kind of, you know, day-to-day products, but also kind of what those parent companies are doing in terms of equality, in terms of modern slavery, in terms of climate. Local networks are really useful, I think, if you're place-based and you're trying to find a solution or a good contractor. Talking to other cultural organisations is really useful. Big organisations have resources, particularly universities, to really address procurement. Smaller organisations have less time. So kind of, yeah, shorten your journey, borrow what you can. These are the three northern networks that we work that we're part of and we work with quite a lot, but there's usually a network somewhere close to you. Other support we've had over the years has come through the Growth Company, and that's a local authority funded organisation. They helped us first engage with procurement and kind of what we might do. The big thing with procurement, I think, is to approach it from the scale at which you're working. If a policy is useful, great. If an action plan is useful, great. If you just want to make incremental changes, that's also great. Sometimes kind of one size really doesn't fit all, but putting at the heart of it kind of what you want to do and where you want to go is key. Also, what we've got is kind of the B Corps that are appearing now, or companies that have gone through quite a rigorous certification process. So again, kind of look out for that on companies and organisations you might want to work with. It can sometimes feel a little bit lonely, but just to kind of remind us that we're on this journey together, you know, to kind of share what we find, learn from others within our kind of community about how to do things best. Nobody's printed the greatest list of do's and don'ts. There's kind of mostly only signposts, and that's why value-driven kind of choices are really value-driven kind of, you know, ethical environmental choices are really important, and taking time to think about those. Here's our website. If there's anything, you're very welcome to peruse it. There's some kind of local examples up here in Greater Manchester, but there's also some resources we've created over the years. I hope that's been helpful. It's probably a bit thematic, but Natasha will talk about things far more specifically. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to leave it to Natasha now to talk about the depot in Lewes.
Great. Hello, everyone. I'll just do my sharing business. Is that all showing okay?
Yes.
Yeah, great. But I'm going to start my timer now because I tend to like talking. Great. So thank you so much for asking me to speak on the subject of procurement and local resilience. So I'm the Office and Sustainability Manager at Depot Cinema in Lewes, East Sussex. And this is our venue from 4 different viewpoints. So we're an independent 3-screen cinema. We run events, we have an education programme, a restaurant, bar, cafe. So we're quite a multi-use space, as well as very much definitely being a cinema. So we've had sustainability as a core value and approach from the conception, the idea of what we were going to be, and we're a renovated building, so there was lots of opportunity to integrate key elements within the infrastructure of the building. And so my job then is to work with all the team members to ensure that we're operationally maintaining those values. So I just want to talk briefly about sort of the key values that we use with our procurement and our sustainability and whole business approach, actually. And one is, I had to look up this term a number of years ago. I suddenly realized somebody mentioned triple bottom line accounting, and I didn't know what that meant, but I realized that is what we do. We're always trying to weigh up the impacts of what we do in our accounting for people, planet and profit in equal measures. So we're always trying to balance those 3 elements in our decision making. In terms of procurement, we're always striving for a circular economy approach rather than a extract, construct, manufacture, make, chuck away as a linear approach that we have to a lot of our supply chain still in the world, to one that is a closed loop, so that we have a finite number of resources, so we need to keep those resources in the loop going round and round, because we can't just keep extracting and not giving back. So that's sort of, we're thinking about in terms of circular economy, we think about the supplies we get in, how they get here, what they're made of, who's made them, also how we're going to use them in the space, how can we make the most of them when they're in our venue, and then what happens to them when they leave our building, those materials, in whatever form they leave. So then our third sort of overarching principle is, this diagram has helped really very plainly and simply sets out our priorities in terms of goods and services that we bring in, that the most desirable, this hierarchy and the ordering of this is quite important. There's a lot of emphasis putting on recycling things without looking at all the bigger issues in a way above that. Not to say that recycling isn't important. So trying to eliminate and reduce wherever possible first, the stuff that you have got to reuse it and repurpose, keep it in use, and then really what you can't do at the end of that, making sure you're recycling so those materials go back into the chain as much as possible. And then the third one is local, trying to keep as local as possible. There's lots of benefits, and I'll talk about those a bit more in a bit. So this is a little sort of mantra that keeps sticking with me, and I think last minute buying decisions came up, I think, in the Julie's Bicycle piece of work. And I always come back to it. If you're making very quick decisions and not thinking about what you're ordering and where it comes from and how, then you're likely to be a sucker for convenience. And convenience has really got us into this trouble, particularly when we're looking at single-use items and lack of quality items and reuse being built into it. really convenience and speed and efficiency has really become the enemy. And you know, the devil is in the detail. It is really hard to navigate purchasing. It's all stuff that we keep creating, and you know, it is complicated. So there's some real lessons to be learned for all of us, to take more time and find ways to do conscious decision making for everything. So let me just check I've got these slides slightly in the wrong order. But you know, as has already been mentioned, you know, one size doesn't fit all. There is no just right decisions, and we all have to navigate our own path based on our, you know, our place-based decisions. And each decision does sit within a multitude of considerations with vigorous research needed, and it usually needs a team approach. And we're real fans of you know, picking low-hanging fruit, try lots of little projects, or do one small change at a time. And we're a big fan of this trial period shown here, and wherever possible, trying to communicate with our customers what we're doing and why, and what the impacts might be. So you know, there's going to be a lot of weighing up and a lot of research to try and match up the practice, you know, what's going to work on a practical basis, usability, durability, affordability, you know, the aesthetics. We're very keen on maintaining a particular look and feel to our venue, as well as the ethical, environmental considerations. So it's very complicated. But we do believe in very careful communications with our customers, so they can maybe have insights into understanding why we're doing what we're doing, hoping we'll inspire people, and bringing them on the journey with us. So just a little bit more about strategy. I sort of feel like our values are very, very strong, and we do a lot of stuff. And then I find myself creating the supporting paperwork a little bit afterwards. So I'm sort of trying to change that, but it all sort of has to, a firm believer in having a strategy and doing it at the same time, because you learn. It's great to have a written up policy and a strategy, but it's, you know, you can only get so far with theory, so it's always good to be doing something practical as well. There's so much learning to be done, and getting things wrong and trial and error. So we do have a procurement policy, and I do recommend writing up your intentions and looking at the scope of where all your supplies come from and what they're made of. I think it's a really useful exercise. Being able to write up the different practices you put into place is really useful. So, you know, we have a bin guide for staff. You know, we want to bring our partners and suppliers and vendors that visit our venue to be on board with us. So, you know, writing up what our approach is and giving that to them and supporting each other is it is really useful to have the backing of some paperwork. And so, yeah, just to echo that, you know, where you invest your money is really important. And what I like about changing contracts, I'm not saying it's easy, but behaviour change is such a big challenge that you know, being able to change to more ethical contracts is somewhat a paper process. It's not asking people to change the way they do things and have habit change. Plus that, you know, those investments are really significant. You know, pensions in this country is a massive investor in fossil fuels. You know, we think energy is the most obvious one we think of, but banking and pensions is really important. We get our heads around where that money is being invested. We do have problems with with banking, we haven't really found a good solution to that, because there's lots of, because of the scale of our business, there's lots of cash handling associations with our banking and practical implications. So I don't know whether we'll be able to make leeway with those, but certainly pensions and energy, we've done a lot of research, and we know we've got good sound investments with those. We try to shop local wherever possible. Reducing those travel emissions is really, really important. We've got to stop transporting things massive long distances. When we shop local, we can really work in, we can have, you know, person-to-person contact with those businesses. We can work, there's lots of great opportunities for partnership working, being able to then really understand the provenance and avoid the greenwash, working with local suppliers. We're also find that the size of our business, we have quite a lot of local clout, and we're a really good customer to have. So you know, we can also then challenge and demand more responsible practices, and that often suppliers are really up for that as well. So we really want to try and create local resilience by all supporting each other, because that is good. You know, the reality of our future is that we do need to have more local resilience and not expect everything to be able to come from far away. And supporting local economy is, you know, it's really important. It's really inspiring. Being, you know, they create really interesting stories to tell, and you know, we have really good working relationships with farms and local businesses, which is great. I just want to talk a few of our proud successes. We're really chuffed to have found Hampstead Tea, and they've really worked. It's really worked for us. Having their tea, it's biodynamic, organic tea. The bags have no plastic in them, so completely plastic-free tea, and there's really fantastic social aspects to their business as well. Only serving tap water from carafes at a water table and not having any bottled water. We're really proud of that move. We don't make money from bottled water, but you know, glass is very heavy. The transportation of one drink of water in glass or cans or plastic just seems quite crazy to us. So it's a bit of a logistical feat to keep the water jugs always changed and filled, but it's worked really well for us. We work with a local coffee company. Obviously the coffee doesn't come from the doorstep, but it comes in reusable tubs, so we'd have no packaging from our coffee, which is absolutely brilliant. We make an enormous amount of coffee at Depot for customers. It's off the scale. So it's fantastic. There's no packaging from there. Neither is there from the milk. So our milk comes from local farms in glass, and the bottles are reused and cleaned each time. And we've worked with a number of local farms on developing that relationship, and that's just fantastic, knowing the provenance of those cows. And inspired by home in Manchester, they've got on the bottom right this toucan ecosystem. We now, you know, installing this system to make our own multi-purpose cleaner, paid for itself in a year, and it's a bit of a magic system where we're now creating our own cleaner pretty much for free, just the price of the water and a tiny bit of electricity and salt. So in terms of those pollutants going in our waterways, it's vastly reduced, and it's worked out really affordable for that. It's important to say that not every change is affordable. We sort of accept that some changes and choices make great environmental savings and others don't. Here are a few of my frustrations. You know, however many times we train our staff, create guides, Our staff still use the bins really bad. You know, we've got a big turnover of staff of lots of people from all different walks of life. They forget to take the plastic, or don't know, or don't think to take the plastic packaging off the cardboard. You know, there's a constant that's my timer. Constant reinforcing with the team, trying to stay positive about it. We find our cinema concessions difficult in terms of packaging, and feel like there's a lot of waste packaging from that, and we've tried so many different things, and we sort of keep banging our heads against brick wall and then leaving it for a while. My other little bugbear is I would just love not to have Coca-Cola at depot, but we have to balance what people want as well, and being an attractive offering that is inclusive. So we did try a more hippie cola in the very early days, and it just doesn't go down well, and it is very, very expensive. So we wish we could make a shift on that, but maybe I just have to accept that's my bugbear. And just lastly, you know, we've done some really exciting things this year. You know, our building is now 6.5 years old, and suddenly everything does start to fall apart. And you know, we're a very high use building, so we really sort of find it difficult that things aren't built to last longer. You know, is a big issue. So what we've made some really great changes that we're really proud of this year. You know, all our lounge sofas we've had reupholstered by a local tradesman with recycled fabrics used. Our new coffee machine is 35% more efficient. So whilst we're getting a whole new machine in, at least it's a lot more efficient. And our restaurant chairs, we've replaced with ones that we can maintain better in the future, so we can just reupholster these smaller sections rather than them being a lot more fabric based. And we're really chuffed to now have a water-free, waterless urinals, so we're saving a huge amount of water via those toilet systems. I always like to bring in toilets somewhere in my presentations, but that is we're really proud of that, and it's helped our systems run better, as well as saving lots of water, and it's a lot less smelly, which is great. So I hope there's been some useful insights there, and yeah, I would just say that wherever you can, try and integrate a sort of methodology to your decision making, so everything you bring in, eventually you have made a conscious decision that comes through the door, and that, you know, the whole team has to work together with your decision making to make sure it meets all that complex criteria. So thanks for listening.
Thank you so much. I do remember that the first conversation we had together was actually a lot about talking about bins and how much you also like to bring the waste, toilets, all of that in the conversation, which I think is great. And yeah, that was very, very interesting. So thank you very much. So I'll start with just like a couple of questions, like jumping in like a few elements you mentioned. I know, Simon, you said there was no do's and don'ts list, and that's also a question for you, Natasha. Do you still have like any kind of useful, like where to get started resource, like where should an organization go first when looking at their journey? Can be like, yeah, like where to look online, but also what would be the main thing an organization should start looking at? Like you mentioned, pension, energy supplier, partnerships. Where does one, start?
I think the place to start are those shared values and your organizational approach to mitigating kind of the impacts of human activity on the planet. Sorry, that's a really long way of saying it, but a kind of climate change sometimes narrows it down from kind of what's happening environmentally. I think so that's the first place to start, because as Natasha said, it'll take the whole team to really kind of address this, but kind of getting on the same page and empowering ourselves to make those decisions and those choices will speed up the process and kind of make it more effective. You know, if you're reporting, it can be really useful. Reporting can be useful to some organizations, less so for others. That can help you kind of understand your footprint, but kind of scope 3 is really hard to count. There are not many organizations, unless you're huge, like a council or a university, who can really kind of address that. So I think kind of borrow the knowledge. There's really obvious areas of impact, but I think, you know, around kind of sort of energy and travel and water and waste, but actually kind of really digging into kind of indeed, as they have at the depot, into kind of, you know, that journey of anybody through the organization, in terms of, you know, what those choices mean, whether I go there for a cup of tea or a coffee, or you know, how the organization has kind of has helped.
Yeah, and I would say I would agree with that. And I think it's really useful to have someone like someone do a load of the research first and like make a start on it. Like, it does take a whole team approach, but you know, we're all really short of time, and you know, each change that you try to make, you know, just one small project, there's a lot in there, and I don't want that to put you off doing it, but it's being realistic about what resources we can give to it. So I think, you know, I've started as the administrator here, and I'm very used to researching things. So I would often, you know, my sort of role started by being given, like, can you research upholstery fabrics, or can you I've spent years now just researching, and so I put to finding anyone within your team who's good at that, to just keep going and googling things. The ethical consumer I've found really, really useful for short tracking, even on this commercial scale, and to just get a load of research done first on something, and then take it to the team. I've found a useful way, and then that starts to, and then you shortlist quite quickly from there. And it is a practice, you know, it's like doing exercise. Any discipline, the more you do it, the more practiced you get at it. And you know, we fast track a lot quicker now. You know, the waterless urinal was an absolute dream. You know, it was really quick and easy process. We were sort of a bit of a well-oiled machine at it, and we've learned about what some of the pitfalls are. So just get up and start doing something, and something that sparks enthusiasm and passion, and maybe a bit of anger as well. Like, I hate that we create so much of this. You know, you can use that to spur you to make a change there.
Yeah,
except that not all of them will work. You know, some you throw out now and again, but we've just got to keep trying and trying our best.
Anger is a good energy to channel often. Actually, Natasha, can you tell us how many visitors a year Depot has? That's a question.
Ooh. I should know this because we just had our
put on the spot here.
I'm sorry, I'm just terrible with numbers.
That's okay. A lot. No,
sorry.
actually, no, that's fine. It leads me to actually a question around visitors and like all the things you've implemented. And I know you still have to offer Coke to your audience, but I guess that this incentivizing the visitors by offering, you know, green ethical options, have you like ever felt a pushback? And also, I guess, in terms of resources, how, you know, easy has it been to implement for your venue, also like financially speaking, because often there's this argument against, you know, green options costing more, at least in the short term. Sorry, that was 2 questions in one.
So can you just quickly say what the 2 questions were?
So
incentivizing
pushback from the visitors or not? Yeah. And
you have to make it really easy for the customers. It's as with staff, it will only work if it's practical and you make it easy. You know, people are just they're creatures of habit. So you have to make something very sort of ergonomic, and you have to really think through and physically try out the practical things you're going to implement, because a change like moving from hand towels to air dryers, you wouldn't believe what a fluster people get, because they come to your venue with such a level of expectations that you didn't even know could be that in depth. So people are going to be resistant. That's where I think the communicating and what you're doing can help ease that passage. And yeah, I don't think people come here because of that, because of what we do, and often they're surprised when they learn, you know, the level of thought that's gone behind what milk we have. But it's a fine line with shoving things down people's throats and being a bit preachy and being encouraging. So you know, we do incentivize that, you know, if people bring their own coffee cup, they get 15% off, for example. So there are incentives, but it's not why people come here. But it's great that we do it anyway.
You said something during the presentation that's really important, and that's the invitation to join us on a journey. And that's a really lovely way of putting it, I think. You know, as an organisation, we're going to be honest about where we are on our journey, what we found easy, what we're finding more difficult. But here's an invitation to kind of, you know, join us and to kind of participate. And that's a really nice kind of neutral way to kind of meet your audiences, your customers, your visitors, however you like to think of. None of us like to be told what to do. You know, we all like to think we have a choice, even if we don't sometimes. But then also you can make kind of big decisions, can't you, around your building? We are going to do this. We're not going to do this. You know, that is, you know, that's you know, your prerogative as an organisation.
yeah, I'm thinking about like other examples of organization who do that well and like share the journey and are honest about, to avoid greenwashing, also like share the learning and the successes, but also the challenges they've met. And I know Eden Court in Inverness and also Phoenix in Exeter are doing a lot of good work around that as well. But yeah, I guess like that second question, Natasha, was also about yeah, like, you know, as a venue with like limited financial resources, like, has it been like, obviously you make a choice, things are more expensive than others, and I know you've got new buildings, so there's elements like refurbishing or this kind of thing that are a bit easier. Home is a bit similar that way, where we're in quite a lucky position to have a good building. But yeah, do you, like, after like a few years of having implemented like a better better systems, do you see the financial benefits, and has it been hard to like find the resources for those things?
Yeah, I'm not sure it does pay financially. I think we still pay hand over fist for being more environmental and ethical in our decision making. There are some things that we have made really significant savings on. You know, that the waterless urinal, we're saving a lot of water there. The cleaning fluid system, paid for itself in 1 year, and there's no pollutants, and it's virtually free, particularly in a time when we installed that just before the pandemic, but then everyone was paying a fortune for sanitizing products. We don't have to do any of it. It's all certified, it comes under that safety thing. So I think it's very hard to judge whether it financially pays off, but probably more often not still.
I think the financial argument misses the point as well about kind of ethical and environmental decision making. You know, I really kind of the kind of cheaper kind of or disregarding kind of the impacts, whether that's kind of environmental or on people, is really kind of, you know, is pretty unacceptable now for an organization. It's very hard for an organization to kind of justify that. So once upon a time it was kind of couched in it's all of it can save you loads of money. I said, you know, you're right, it's not a big money saver, but things do even out, don't they, as you're describing, Natasha. One thing kind of drops in its financial cost, you know, or its resource cost, you know, another thing rises, and these things tend to kind of balance out.
Yeah, and when we quantify using that, you know, those three values, the people, planet, and profit, then it's a whole different scale. So it's only one of three elements to judge the value on.
Absolutely. And also what you were saying about the like virtuous circle of like localized resilience, and like the fact that you are supporting the business around you as well. And I think also you, Simon, speaking from like a Greater Manchester perspective, and with the other organization you're working with as part of GMAS, like, yeah, the benefit to the bigger ecosystem that is the city, that is the businesses around you. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like the kind of the growth hub that I mentioned were really useful to us, in kind of they're linking all sorts of businesses. And they've been really good at kind of actually adapting some of their programs to be in a bit more cultural speak. That kind of helps. Business speak, not always terribly kind of helpful, I think. Yeah, so kind of talking, you know, you don't have to solve everything yourself. You know, there's someone in an organization not very far from you who might have done this or is thinking about it. You know, I think all's fair in when it comes to the climate and environmental conversation, that we can borrow readily and from what other people have done. And I think one of the great things about the network up here is kind of, you know, people who run buildings have a lot in common. Those who don't also have a lot in common. You know, different approaches to outdoor work and festivals and power, and city council here has done a lot on kind of outdoor stuff. So it's really, yeah, it's really great when you can kind of, you know, there's a resource, but also there's somebody who's practicing it that you can go and learn from. One of the things that came to mind, actually, I really like the permaculture principles. They're a different way. They're a different way of the triple bottom line, really. But they describe themselves as kind of earth care, people care, fair share. And I've yet to find a kind of way of defining it that feels better. It's kind of beautifully simple, if that appeals to anyone.
Yeah, and I agree about you know, the network thing. It was just so fantastic. You know, earlier last year when the UKCA's conference was all around sustainability, you know, the whole conference, and it was just fantastic. Everyone was very open and willing to share. And I think you know, the climate and ecological crisis does transcend those boundaries of, you know, competition and things. I think it's a real uniter, and none of us are going to outcompete each other as cinemas with tackling the climate crisis. You know, I don't think any of us will suffer as a result of working together. And it's, you know, we've learnt so many good tips from other cinemas. You know, Home has short-tracked us to a number of really key changes that we've made, because we trust them. We know they've done loads of research. It was more a question of seeing whether it worked for our venue. You know, so it's been, you know, it's really fantastic to learn from each other and share our journeys. And we should, you know, the more the better.
Absolutely. And it's nice to see like cinemas like Mammoth Cinema, for instance, presented at UKCA conference, like a tiny cinema in Nottingham, like chat with people from the Care Zone and Picture House, and like have this kind of like sharing that, as you said, isn't like, it's a global issue that concerns all of us. And it is very much about like gaining as much insight from like the people in those venues and what they're doing.
Yeah. A bit like the Sustainable Development Goals. I think it's really hard. I can't find anyone who can argue against them. You know, they just kind of like, how, you know, how could you? Well, you know, if you're some terrible despot, probably, but you know, it's really hard to argue against kind of those kind of 17 goals. Most people are, as you know, most people have very similar thoughts around climate and environment. So you're kind of, you know, there's a community that is really close and within the sector.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think anyone would disagree with them, but it's another thing to see the link on, you know, when you just order stuff and don't, you know, it's more habits and complacency, and or just not consciously, you know, thinking about the different things that you bring in the building, for example, that can happen. It's just making that link between the two, isn't it? That our impacts are part of that picture.
Yeah, and you show, like, what I really appreciate with what you're talking as well about is that you're presenting a lot of very practical things to implement. And I think a lot of the time you hear people getting very overwhelmed about, you know, like that big like scope 3 emission word that you mentioned. It's like, but how do we even control this kind of thing at home, for instance? You know, it's like a lot of the impact is audience travel, and there's a limit to what we can control here. But having this conversation about like what we can actually do at the venue, like, you know, removing plastic, changing to LED lights, having a motion sensor in every room, is, you know, like how we get those things like little by little to change and improve.
Yeah, and you can see it and feel it when you actually get up and do a change, which, you know, it is rewarding and satisfying if you can actually see and feel something, and then it, you know, it takes a bit of injection of time and energy, but then when it smoothens out and it just becomes another habit, it's like all the other habits, and it, you know, you're generally sort of plain sailing, and then when you build one on top of another of those things, it, you know, it builds a really powerful picture.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think if there's something you can't change, or it's hard to change at this moment in time, move on to something else, come back to it. So, not all organizations can do everything, certainly not all at once. So kind of, you know, go on your journey, you know, what suits you, what are you good at, you know, what's your contribution that you can make kind of locally and globally.
Those are some nice concluding words, because we're reaching the end of the session. Thank you so much to you both for joining us and for being so generous with your time and expertise. Thank you to the audience who joined us today. We will be announcing our February session very soon, so keep an eye out on the bigger picture and via your own Hub's newsletter and social platforms. And also on the 25th of January, Julie's Bicycle is running a webinar as part of the BFI Sustainable Screen Program. This is for cinemas, festivals, screen archives, and sector organizations who want to better understand how they are doing in terms of their environmental performance and programs. So I'm just going to pop the link in the chat so you can register. And also for the programmers among you, Film Hub Wales has recently refreshed their biodiverse big screen programming pack. So if you're looking for inspiration for green titles, I really recommend you check that out also here. And yeah, the session will be uploaded on YouTube soon. So if you know anyone who might have enjoyed the session, we'll make sure to make this available and share it with the network. So thank you again for joining us, and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Barbara.